So here we're going to go over fatty acid activation. And activating a fatty acid marks it down for beta oxidation, which occurs inside our mitochondrial matrix. But what is fatty acid activation? Essentially, it is taking a coenzyme A group and attaching it to our fatty acid. So this depiction over here is just of a general fatty acid. You can see we have our carboxylic group, and then we also have an R notation, and this R simply denotes that we have an arbitrary number of carbons. Remember that a fatty acid can have a varying length of number of carbons. It could have 5 carbons, it could have 10, 15, 12, however many it may be. This is just a general depiction where R could be any given number of carbons. Also remember that fatty acids, they can be saturated or unsaturated. So when the fatty acid forms that bond with the coenzyme A, we get fatty acyl-CoA. And this reaction is catalyzed by acyl-CoA synthetase, and it utilizes ATP, and we're going to get AMP and pyrophosphate as byproducts along with water. So taking a look at this mechanism, we can see that what happens is that our fatty acid, it exists in its deprotonated state. Over here it was protonated, and in its deprotonated state, oxygen bears that negative charge, and it's going to act as a nucleophile and attack this phosphate group over here on our ATP. Now ATP, it's adenosine triphosphate. We have 3 phosphate groups, so triphosphate, and then we have our adenosine, which is made up of adenine and a sugar. Now when the fatty acid attacks that phosphate, this oxygen is going to be lost with this phosphate. And we can take a look at this product over here, where this oxygen over here, it's coming from our fatty acid. It is not coming from ATP. So this phosphate will be the one going off with this oxygen. So as a result, since this part of the ATP is acquired by the fatty acid, we lose this part, and this part is known as pyrophosphate. Essentially, we have 2 phosphate groups that are bound to one another, and is referred to as pyrophosphate, and it is going to be lost as a byproduct. Now we can see that we have our first product, which is fatty acyl adenylate. This is our fatty acid group. We have our phosphate, and then we have our adenosine, and we are enzyme bound. Which enzyme are we going to be bound to? That is our acyl-CoA synthetase. So this first intermediate is bound to acyl-CoA synthetase. The next step is also a quick step because we are enzyme bound, in which this coenzyme A group acts as a nucleophile and attacks that carbon. It's attacking that carbon number 1 on our fatty acid, and as a result, this oxygen is going to be lost to the phosphate, and we get AMP as a byproduct. So we have adenosine, and this is adenosine monophosphate. So we have 1 phosphate. So this is 1 phosphate. This is adenosine. We lose AMP, and we get our final product of fatty acyl-CoA, where the coenzyme A group has formed a bond with our fatty acid. Now this is our activated fatty acid, and it's going to be transported into the mitochondrial matrix, where it's gonna go under go beta oxidation to produce both FADH2 and NADH, and these 2 electron carriers are going to go on to the ETC to produce the electron transport chain to produce ATP via oxidative phosphorylation. Now we talked about this product we get of pyrophosphate, which is essentially 2 phosphate groups that are bound together. But through a spontaneous process, the pyrophosphate is actually going to be split in half to produce 2 inorganic phosphates via an enzyme known as inorganic pyrophosphatase. Now, this is a highly exergonic reaction, so this will occur, and instead of having pyrophosphate, you will see 2 phosphates. Now, an important question to ask yourself is how much ATP is used in fatty acid activation. So fatty acid activation involved going from a fatty acid, adding that coenzyme A group to get fatty acyl-CoA, where it's ready to undergo beta oxidation. And in the process, you went from ATP to AMP. So instead of going from ATP to ADP, which is the equivalent of using 1 ATP, we are going to AMP. And going to AMP is equivalent to 2 ATP equivalents. So how much ATP is used in fatty acid activation? 2 ATP equivalents are used in fatty acid activation because we are going from ATP to AMP. And that is essentially fatty acid activation. It is simply the process of the fatty acid acquiring a coenzyme A group and becoming fatty acyl-CoA so it can undergo beta oxidation. And once we understand beta oxidation, we can understand why it is so important to add in that coenzyme A group. Because remember, the final product of beta oxidation is going to be our acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA needs coenzyme A. That is why we are adding coenzyme A to the fatty acid so we can produce acetyl-CoA.